So my bit, in terms of the diagnosis of FASD, is what tends to happen is that a community paediatrician will have done the history with a parent and child, and there would be strongly suspected or known alcohol exposure in pregnancy, and those children would be referred into the psychology service for neuropsychological assessment to ascertain whether their neuropsychological profile is in keeping or consistent with what we tend to see in alcohol exposure. And what we tend to see, if we're looking at a textbook typical case, is here. So generally speaking, verbal ability is lower than non-verbal ability. We know that expressive language is generally a lot higher, however, than receptive language. So what people with FASD can say is often a lot more than what possibly is understood underneath that. IQ can be normal, or there can be general learning disability. So if you imagine the brain to be like a computer system, the frontal lobes where executive functioning is housed is almost like the hard drive of that computer system. So even if you've got all your programs in place and everything all there and present, if the hard drive of the computer is not working, then it can't run those programs efficiently. So even if your IQ is normal, if this bit's not working efficiently, it can't run that IQ efficiently. So I always split executive functioning into hot and cold processes. So executive functioning is essentially a skill set. So cold processes are all those kind of academic things, like working memory, sustained attention, the ability to switch attention from one thing to the other, planning, organisation, all of those kind of things. And then hot executive functioning is more of the social side, so think difficulties such as social immaturity, social naivety, the hyperactivity, being sort of out of step with peers, all friendship problems, all of those kind of things are kind of like hot executive functioning problems. So what you tend to see in children and young people with FASD is many will have difficulties in both camps, but some children, young people, might have more problems in one area than the other. Working memory is part of the executive functioning system, as are attention problems. And sort of the reason why many young people with FASD end up with a diagnosis of ADHD is because ADHD is in and of itself a disorder of the executive functioning system. All the hyperactivity, the impulsivity, inattention, all of that stuff is part of that skill set. So you can see, if you think of that computer system, even if your IQ is 100, if you can't sustain attention, if you can't sort of, sit still in the classroom, if you're forgetting what's being said to you, all of this stuff, because your executive functioning is impaired, you're going to really struggle to function at that IQ of 100 level, no matter what. And that's what can be really confusing for teachers in school. This is just an example. It's not complete to scale, but of executive functioning is on a developmental trajectory. So if you think of your average 2-year-old, so you've got age across the bottom here, and kind of level of executive functioning here. If you think of your average 2-year-old, they don't have a lot of executive functioning skills at that point, which is why their attention is quite poor. You can't really reason with them. You're running around trying to stop them running into roads and this kind of thing. That's your average 2-year-old anyway. And around that time, a young person, and this is often around the time sort of 1-2 that many children, of course, are adopted. There's not always a massive difference between children with FASD and children without FASD at this point. And this is the point where many people adopt children without knowing what may happen in the future. The point at which that gap and the differences become more noticeable is around that sort of 6 to 8-year-old period. And that's the point at which the frontal lobes of a typically developing child start to really sort of come into their own, and they start to mature, and you can reason with them more, and they can sustain attention more, all of these things, and they become a lot more independent, whereas a young person with FASD is not going to be developing those skills at that rate. So that's where that gap starts to really widen, and that's where the diagnoses tend to come into play around those sort of ages. And what happens, obviously, over time is in young people with FASD, the executive functioning will develop, but it won't ever develop to the same level as a young person.